Amazing ones. I want to let you know that if you are starting a book or a business or a creative project and the idea of that seems impossible, like, for example, perhaps it just feels like a massive task, or there's too much to do, or you're so far behind, today's conscious conversation is just for you. Even if you think that your project is going to take forever and you can't see how you can start now when so many other people are many miles ahead of you, I want you to know that today's guest felt exactly the same way. So let's dive into the conversation with Robbie Swale. He is a leader, he is a coach, he is a writer, and he knows how to start. He has even written a book about it, which we are going to be chatting about today. So let's dive in. Robbie, welcome to the broadcast studio.
Oh, Gabriella, thanks for having me. And I have to say, the book's been out for about 5 weeks, and one of the things that has certainly not got old is seeing it in someone else's hand in a picture or a video. Really lovely. So thanks for holding it up as well.
You're so welcome. I hope you saw my little post-its that I've been putting in. And actually I tell you what, I confess, I haven't been reading it in order. I've been dipping and diving in. I quite like to do that when it's a book of essays.
Yeah, lovely. And I think I wrote that somewhere in the introduction. I guess when you put out a book, especially with the structure that it has, and we'll maybe get into that, I don't know how different people will want to kind of read it, consume it. And I'm a kind of start to finish type. So I'm pretty sure if I was reading it from scratch, that's how I do it. And it's definitely been put together to be able to be read like that. But I kind of imagine, or like not imagine, hope, right? When I think of the books that are a bit like it, then that I've used, then often they've had that feel to them of like, both they can be read from start to finish. And well, it's a book about creativity, really about the creative process. Now, that doesn't end if you're gonna keep making things, if you've got that kind of calling or itch. And my experience, the struggles don't really end, although they do change a little as time goes on. And so I can really imagine that, at different times, I love that you've got those sticky notes in there. I felt quite touched actually when you said that, showed that. And I can really imagine, it's great. That's how I'd like it to be used, to dip in, to read the titles of the chapters, or just flick in and trust that the universe will open the book on the correct page for you and see what happens.
Yeah, I love that you make that comment of like trusting the universe. There have been a couple of mornings where I thought, oh, I'm gonna just dive back in again, and I've opened it up and I'm just like, oh yeah, I really needed to hear that today. So yeah, there's been some synchronicity with it. So I want to start with a little bit of what I was saying in the introduction, because actually that was taken from one of the essays earlier on in the book, where you really talk about this idea of starting, and you give a really good example. Like, you were thinking of all of those things. It seems like such a Herculean task. So many other people are further ahead. So I'd love for you to provide the concept. This was actually not with regards to writing a book, but it was a website that you wanted to set up. So for someone who's like, yeah, that's everything that I've been thinking, and really, has this guy thought the same thing but begun on the project?
Yeah, is this the David Gemmell website? Is that the one? Yeah. So do you know David Gemmell at all?
I don't know. I mean, I had to Google him after reading it.
So David Gemmell is my favorite novelist, and he died in 2006 or 2007, which is very sad because he was a prolific author. He wrote about 2 books a year from 1984 until he died. They're these kind of punchy fantasy novels, but they're much, much more than that. At least some people do, and there's like, it's fun because the internet means I can hang out in a Facebook group with a lot of other people who completely agree with me. And at some point, I realized that that actually David Gemmell's books had, as well as being great stories that follow, amazing, kind of classic story arcs, and people who don't get it with David Gemmell would say he repeats the same story over and over again, which is kind of true. But actually, he was doing that deliberately because he used to love a particular writer of Western novels who basically wrote the same book over and over again. It didn't matter because they were so good. And David Gemmell's like that, but they're fantasy. And they're a little more than that, because I realized basically that I was at some point thinking, how did I like come to the values that I had? And it started actually with realizing that I never got satisfied with success, that I was always on to the next thing. And I wondered if that was because I'd spent too much time watching Sir Alex Ferguson be interviewed. And he famously, after a European Cup win or something, they said, "How long will you celebrate, Alex?" Or Sir Alex, I don't know if he was 90 at the time. He said, "Probably about 5 minutes. And then I'll be thinking about the next one." And that's after the biggest achievement he could have had in his career. And I wondered if that had been influential on me, or maybe that part of me had come from somewhere else. And then I thought, who else had been influential? And I realized that David Gemmell had, because there were these messages of essentially philosophy, life philosophy, that were throughout this, throughout his 30 to 33 novels. And I wondered if I could make something out of that, because it didn't seem like anyone else had. And I can feel a bit of anxiety coming back now. And then I didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
For, I'm going to say, from the idea to when, and thankfully, like I feel very lucky, my story ends with, I have that website now. It exists. You can find it at wisdomofgemmell.com. But I'm going to say 3 years between that idea and maybe a little longer, and it actually starting. And yeah, all of those things went through my mind. Everything from like, it'll take me. So the bit I did do was I always go back to reading David Gemmell every few years, but I particularly go back to it when I'm not in a good space, because it reminds me about hope and humanity and courage and lots of those wonderful values that matter to me. And I went back to it at one point in a pretty difficult time in my life, and I decided that what I would do as I went is fold down all the pages where I thought there was a little quote, a little bit of David Gemmell wisdom as I went. So I did at some point have that. But that was probably at least a year after I'd had the idea, and it had been ticking away in the back of my mind. And I should add in, like, I think it's in one of the chapters in the book too. It's like there had been other ideas that I thought were as good as this. And in fact, they were kind of better from a business point of view. I've never made a penny out of the Wisdom of David Gemmell website, not that I particularly wanted to, that I'd had and done nothing about, and then seen someone else do. And the worst thing for me looking back at that story is I'd had this experience of having like a great business idea and a book idea, both of which I didn't do anything about, both of which appeared in the universe. And it's like the crushing realization that I hadn't done them and that they were there was pretty painful.
Yeah.
And so despite all that, I still didn't do anything about this website. And it was like, it was, who am I to do this? Of course was there. It's like had I built a website. I'd been part of building a website for a couple of charities that I'd worked for.
Yeah.
But I didn't didn't do any, I didn't, neither did I know how to do it, nor do anything about learning how to do it. It felt like there were just too many things. Like I didn't know, like it would take me forever. I had lots and lots of stories and thoughts about like, I'll get started when, or if I can, how will I send them to people? Where will it go? Even like, can I automate it was one of the things. Like, I don't know how to automate it was one of the reasons I did nothing.
Yeah.
And then there's probably more I could say about that, and we kind of could slow down it a little more. Actually, let me do that. What else was important about that? Yeah, well, there were these conversations with people where there were people I told about it, and and then kind of had to tell them that I hadn't done anything about it. So I'm pretty sure that was happening. I'm pretty sure, not 100%. And then in the end, I had this, like what was happening for me at the same time over these 3 years was that I was changing career as well.
Okay.
And I didn't really know how that was going and what was happening. But at some point in that, I went to a workshop about, I think it was called About Possibility. And I just got a great little bit of, we did some pairs work in that workshop, and I got from that, what came out was like, what's the, how many people does this so yeah, so another story I had was like, there's not enough. Oh, there's two more. I've got another two good ones. So one is like, it's not worth doing. So as well as I
Yeah.
can't who am I to do this? I had it's not worth doing because no one will be interested.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't make any sense, those two going together. So I had that. But then the
Yeah.
best one, the one that came out in this workshop, that with this lovely little bit of coaching from my now friend Inga, was that I didn't want to put it live in case someone else stole the idea
Mm.
before I got it to be speech marks big enough or something. Now,
Mm.
given that I'd had these other two ideas, which had been speech marks stolen, someone else had done them, they hadn't been stolen at all, no one had heard my idea or anything like that, but felt like they'd been stolen. They'd been stolen explicitly because I hadn't put them anywhere. I hadn't done anything
Right.
about them. But the story I was telling myself was, I can't, I shouldn't put this live in case someone steals it.
Yeah.
That was exactly the opposite of what I should have been doing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's absolutely ingenious way of getting me to not do anything about the idea. And Inga's piece of coaching was essentially, how many people would need to be like, what's it worth? How many? I've got a son at
Mm.
home. Like, I can't remember how old he was. Like, he was about, I think he was like about the same age at the time that I was when I discovered David Gemmell. And she said something like, would he be enough? Like, if it was just him that found it, would that be enough and make it worthwhile? And then, I'm sitting there and I'm, yeah, of course it would, wouldn't it? And I kind of have to do it now.
Mm.
And I didn't realize it, and maybe we'll get to this. In some ways, this was the first time that I did something that you could call a version of what I now have named the 12-minute method,
Yeah.
because what I settled on was, and I'd been reading, it was definitely helped. I've been reading The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield at the time. So I had his Pressfield's idea of resistance in mind, at some point in this process that had, there. So when I was thinking about it, I was like, I can get the website up and then I can do one. And essentially, so I had by the end of the read through, I had 1,000 little quotes that I wanted to get up. So it actually was a big task. I
Yeah.
wasn't making up that it's a monumental task to take 1,000 things and put them on a website.
Yeah.
And I decided I would do one every week, and that I would
Yeah.
send them to people one at a time as I put them up. And that was in 2015. And apart from a couple of times, once when I just forgot, and once when my mind was fried this year after, by lots of, because we've got a 1-year-old, so by lots of sleepless nights, I've missed some weeks. But other than that, I think I've only missed 2, maybe 3 weeks in those years. And so now there's whatever that would be, 6 years times 50 things, so 300 and something entries on the website. And I separately to that, I decided, I had a lot of the same stories about social media, and I decided I would go on Twitter and I would tweet one a day. And so there's, I've been through them a few times on Twitter now, because there's been quite a few days in those 6 years.
Yeah.
So there's some of that story.
It's such a great example, Robbie, of how we can just chip away. And really that's how this book comes about too. You mentioned this 12-minute method. By just committing to writing an essay in 12 minutes every week, suddenly you've got enough content, not just for one book, but for 4 books, as you share here. I want to go to what you talked about, this ingeniousness in the mind, because actually there's a really fun essay. I'm going to just try to scoop to it really quickly, because it's interesting, isn't it? As a creator, as an artist, we're kind of known for our originality and our inventiveness, and it's something to be celebrated. But as the title of this says, our ingenuity can also hold us back. So I'd love to dive in a little more. There's a bit that I underlined here where you said, how I once convinced myself that by not making a website that had been in my mind for several years, I was protecting my idea from being done by someone else. So there's a kind of irony or real clear delusion when you look at what the ingenuity is saying. You also say, which was a real kind of mic drop moment, we're also sometimes ingenious at not being happy. So I'd love you to talk a little bit more. And it might be, it'd be lovely to have some examples, because I know that you coach people. There's some great coaching examples here. But if we've got someone who's listening saying, oh, that resonates with me. Yeah, I'm being really ingenious in ways that's holding me back. And yes, I think I am being ingenious in a way that is preventing that happiness. I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about that and how you might take someone out of that place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a sad thing to realize that we are sometimes very ingenious at stopping ourselves from being happy. I mean, in that particular essay chapter, there's some. I love the examples in there that I'd just been. I think it's in that one. I'd just been, working on. My friend, or an old client of mine, Molly, had been procrastinating so much on her ebook that she'd started a little side hustle business about um, helping women not have to buy as many dresses for weddings in a Facebook group, just to avoid doing the ebook. And so you get into amazing things like that, and then you get into more sad ones. Like my
Mm.
dad got quite ill,
Mm.
and it's not, I can't draw a line to say it was this, of course not. But just as he was about to work on a big creative project that he wanted to work on, he got quite
Mm.
ill, and it didn't feel like a total coincidence. And so you do get those things.
Yeah.
In terms of being happy, the framework that I think about when I think of that comes from a book called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And he talks about how we all have an upper limit problem. And how, I think the way he would talk about this is that essentially there's some story we have about how happy it's okay for us to be. And that usually, he's a psychotherapist as well as an author. And so I think usually he would say that's written in childhood or adolescence in some way. And he has a few examples. I think there's 4 categories of upper limit problems that people mostly have, and they're all subtly different, but they all amount to the same thing. And what he says happens, and I always imagine a graph for this is your graph of happiness is going up, and then just as it's approaching this upper limit line, it starts to go shallower, and that's actually because we're doing things that we don't think it's safe or okay for us to be happier than that limit. And when I was reading that book, I was reading through the 4 types of upper limit problem, and it's a great book, The Big Leap. It's a kind of weird book. It's got 4 or 5 different concepts in it. It's not 100% obvious to me why those 4 or 5 concepts are in one book together, but they're all so good that I don't mind. So I've been loving the book, and I got to the bit about upper limit problem, and I was reading these 4 things, and I read the first one. I was like, no, that's not me. The second and the third, and I was like, oh, maybe I don't have an upper limit problem, right? Maybe actually I'm okay. And then I read the 4th one, and I was just like, oh yeah.
Mm.
And the 4th one is a fear of outshining others. That's the reason for the upper limit. So it's don't get too happy, don't get too successful, because you'll outshine others, and that's not okay.
Yeah.
And I can tell, I can do a psychoanalysis on myself to say why that would make sense from my childhood in a way. I can, and I'm happy to share that. I don't mind if you think that example would be useful to people. But essentially what that means is, what we do is worry is a classic example, right? So worry is mostly the worry we have in modern life is mostly not real. And he has in that book, and it's a really good book. I recommend it. He gives a great frame for worries. Worry is sometimes useful, but mostly it's our upper limit problems stopping us from being happier than we could be in ingenious ways. We worry about all kinds of weird stuff, as that David Gemmell website, Wisdom of David Gemmell story shows. It's why am I worrying about whether my idea will get stolen? When other ideas have been stolen, why am I not just getting on with it? But also, why does it matter if someone else makes a David Gemmell website if I want to make one? Even that, what's all that about? No one cares except me. What's going on? If I would be happier and fulfilled by making it, just make it.
Yeah.
And I know that now. And of course, I try and tell that to me of 2012, 2013, whenever I first had that idea. What he says to check your worries, a good way, whether they are real and useful, because they sometimes are. Sometimes it's worth worrying about things, and it's really important to remember that. Is 2 questions. Is this worry about a real thing? Yes or no? And if it is there something I can do about it? If the answer to both of those is yes, then that's useful to have. If you're worrying about something that isn't real, it being a problem that someone else might make a website about David Gemmell having some philosophy in his books, that's not really a problem. Just make the website. You ingenious human you, or can I do anything about it? Well, actually in this case I can. So the worry is quite useful, because if I think that worry is real, if it is a problem, if someone else makes the website, well, I can do something about that worry. I can make the website. And then the worry is doing its job. And if instead I just procrastinate, worry, get anxious, and all that kind of stuff, which I do and I still do. And I was just saying to you a few minutes ago before we started recording that it's a really good thing to have written this book for me, because it means that every time I start getting worried and anxious, and like I had it a bit before this interview, I was just noticing it. I was like, oh, I've been interviewed on podcasts and things before. Why am I anxious? That doesn't really make sense. And this is a little different, because this is actually the first interview I've done since the book came out. So I know something's a bit different for me. But it's like, I totally lost my thread in that. That's so funny. So it's like, but then it's great to have written the book, because then at a moment like that, I can go, well, that's okay. Just do this podcast. Do the best you can. Do the first one. You'll learn from the first one. It'll be different next time. It's all learning. Just start.
I love the way that you just end with just start, because the theme of the book is how to start when you're stuck. But what I get a sense from with each of these essays is we go on this lovely journey, and hopefully the people who are watching this are really starting to get a sense of, like, it's not just about talking about writing. It's about talking about the mind. It's about talking about what we're seeing and what we're not seeing. So we kind of go on these lovely journeys, like into the portal of the mind, but we often come back to the message, which is, and now start. So I want to come to next, the power of commitment. This is a lovely piece. Let me come to the page that I've signaled here. The power of commitment. There's a line here where, so you're talking about commitment. You're talking about, in this particular one, you're talking about the commitment you made to write these posts that you were going to put on LinkedIn for 12 minutes every week. And then there's a line here. You say, it was about a commitment to getting more of me and my art out into the world. And underneath that was a commitment to finding my way for my higher self to express itself. But then you say, although I couldn't have told you any of that when I started. And I loved that, because to me, and I know there will be people watching who are like, wait, I can't start because I don't really know what it is I'm starting. And so I'd love for you to speak to that, which is actually part of the commitment of starting, is the commitment to say, I'm going to find out what it is I'm starting, or what it is I'm going to discover.
Yeah. And it's probably worth just telling the story, really, I think, to make sense of that and that sentence. And it's, it is always a strange experience. My sister's always been good at this, occasionally quoting what I've written back to me from these kind of things. But it's just, it's fun to hear that back. And like, I was thinking that last bit, that I didn't know any of that at the start, just before you read the bit where I wrote that. So I'm glad that I wrote that in that piece too.
Yeah.
But so this writing practice that I have, where I write a piece every week in 12 minutes, didn't start because I wanted to write a book, let alone 4. And it didn't even really start, when I've been thinking about it recently, because I wanted a writing practice. It started because I was quite fearful and anxious, finding myself fearful and anxious about sharing anything with the world, basically, online. Like, even a post on Facebook about something to do with nothing, I would be thinking about and feeling anxious about for like minutes, hours before pressing post. And I kind of knew that something was up with that. And I was training as a coach at the time, which is a big part of the work that I do now. And I was working with a beautiful coach called Joel Monk. And because I was in the process of self-discovery and looking at myself and understanding myself, I kind of had this thing that was happening in my life, and I didn't want it to happen. Like, there may have been some sense of outcome. Like, if I want to have a business that relies on being online, if I feel this upset about sharing even a little joke about the football on Facebook, like, what chance do I have? It might have been that. But my memory is that it was mostly, I just didn't want to feel like that about things. And that for me, and then for Joel, gave us the intuition to kind of get into that. And it arrived, the practice itself, the initial practice arrived in a slightly random way. I had a train journey at the time from Clapham Junction, which is in southwest London, near where I live, to London Waterloo, to the part-time job. I think it was part-time that I had at the time. And I told Joel that I liked that time. And I'd used it, I think, to write a poem a previous time as we were playing with creativity. So that was obviously also present. There's something about creativity and something about sharing. And I liked the time because it was kind of free time, because I was already doing something. Like I could relax, it tells you something about my psychology at the time. Like, I could relax because I was already doing something. I was already traveling, and there was no pressure to be doing anything else. And so in the end, and then Joel, in his life before he was a coach, he was a visual artist, and he just said, as far as I know from nowhere, when I was a painter, I used to like painting a series of paintings. And basically from those ingredients, we created a little experiment for me, which was that I think I was on the train 5 times in the next 2 weeks, or 5 days, and I would write, what we committed to was I would write 5 things on the train. Start writing when the train started moving at Clapham Junction, stop writing when it got to Waterloo. I would proofread it once, and I would post it on LinkedIn. And the reason I chose LinkedIn is because, as far as I knew, no one read anything that went on LinkedIn. And certainly it carried less charge than Facebook at the time. And I think that in some ways, it's interesting, those social media platforms, they do have different feels to them. And I knew I needed to do 5 because I liked listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast. And Tim Ferriss said that when he started the podcast, he knew he needed to make more than 1, because if he just made 1, he'd be so mortified about it that he would never make any more. But if he committed to making 5 and told lots of people he would make 5, and I'd told Joel, and that was enough for me, then he wouldn't be able to give up after just 1. And after 5, he would have a much greater grasp of reality than he would after 1. And, I quite often, I always think like at least 3 is a good number. If you, for example, if you're going to start working with people, or you're going to do some interviews for a podcast, like if you do 1, you don't know, and it's weird, you don't know why it's weird yet. If you do 2, you have a better sense. But if you do 3, you can really triangulate. And I had these 5 journeys, and so it made sense to do 5. It turned out a few people did read LinkedIn, and they responded really warmly. I mean, I didn't get huge numbers of like comments or likes, but I got some likes. I think I got some likes on the first one. I got some likes and comments on the second one. And then I went on holiday after that. And it just felt like then I would do 1 a week, because I could tell it was useful. And by then I'd had some of the rush. And there's a funny story about one of the quotes, one of the lines on one of the first few pages of that book, which is I've been quoting Stephen Pressfield as having said something for years that he never said, that I said. And I only discovered this when I tried to find the attribution for the quote. I put a quote in the front of this book. Actually, let me get my one and read it. And it is inspired by something Pressfield says in The War of Art. But I've been quoting Stephen Pressfield for years as having said, our inspiration is always there, but it's at the moment when we commit to something and make the start that we let inspiration in. So I had a very strange experience when I was finalizing the book, which is I thought I better check this quote to make sure I've got it exactly right. And I couldn't find any evidence of Pressfield saying it. And then I found an article I'd written about Stephen Pressfield in 2016, and I'd said it. So it was very lovely. But by the time I'd done those first 5, I'd had that rush a little bit, that sense that inspiration's there waiting. And Pressfield in The War of Art talks about, the muse and the angels. They're all just there. They're just waiting for you to take that little leap. And so I carried on the practice, and that's when I made the commitment. And I didn't really know why I was making it, except that I was trusting. There's another piece I think in that book about following the feeling, right? Having a one-line business plan, essentially. Like, what's the thing you're going to do when the chips are down, or when you're not sure what to do? And I talked about my friend Rich's business plan, which is meet fun and interesting people. And I talk about a client's business plan, which was something like make the greatest possible impact. And I realized that my one-line business plan was follow the feeling. And I have a particular feeling that I could follow. And the feeling was saying, write some more of these. And I'd learned the power of the commitment. And so I did. And then what was interesting was, about 3 years later, 3 years in, I'd received a Seth Godin email, and he'd put together this massive book of a few years of his blogs. And I bought it, which is a strange treat for myself, because it was like 120 quid or something. But it's great. It's so big and heavy. It's on the bottom of the shelf here, but I can't lift it up and get it out. So it'll take me the rest of the time we have. But it's absolutely brilliant. I never read it, but I feel delighted every time I look at it.
Yeah.
And that made me think, there's something about these blogs. I've been writing them for 3 years now. I wonder if I could make a book of them. And the main reason I thought that is I've been thinking quite a bit about, where does my anxiety and worry stop my work reaching other people? Like, that was what had definitely happened. I didn't have a mailing list for the first, like, I don't know, year that I was writing these pieces, and even longer that I've been working as a coach and doing some other things a bit like it. And in the end, I realized, because I thought that might be just a way of me procrastinating, having the mailing list, like, but actually in the end, it felt like it's just stopping. Like, my brother-in-law didn't read my pieces that I was writing on LinkedIn, not because he didn't want to read them, but because he didn't go on LinkedIn very often. And if I gave him the chance to sign up for a mailing list, he would get an email with those in once a month, and he could read them. And the only person, it's hurting everyone for me not to have that.
Yeah.
And LinkedIn is not very easy to navigate. And I thought, if I put these articles in a book, that'll mean the people who want to read them all can read them all, because they're all in one place. And I thought, and what had happened in that time is that I'd stopped getting the train as much, and I'd checked how long the train journey is, and it was about 12 minutes. So I'd started writing with a timer instead, set the timer going, write while the timer's going, stop when it goes off, again, proofread it once, post it. And so I thought it'd be funny, because I could call the book, I wrote this book in 12 minutes. And I talked to my friend Steve about it, because he was going to do some editing, because that's what he does professionally. And he said, yeah, that's really good. And it's confrontational, and it's a bit in your face. And that's great, because it'll make people go, yeah, right. If he can write a book in 12 minutes, I'd better get on with this thing that I'm doing. And then he asked, can the content of the book have that message too? And I'm getting a little shiver when I say this, because then I printed them all off. I printed off 3 years of these blogs, like 150 of them, and I sat down with them. And it turned out that I'd been writing about the creative process that whole time, because that's what I'd been wrestling with. I'd been sitting down every week and writing about what I was interested in, what I was wrestling with, what I was thinking about, trusting that would be interesting sometimes, and feeling like really scared and worried about what I was writing a lot of the time too. And so what I've been writing over those years was all about that. So that's where this is a very long answer to your question, Gabriella.
Great.
This is where that sense of the kind of weaving in and out comes from, because it wasn't me sitting down trying to think systematically, how does someone get through being stuck with creativity? It was me being stuck with creativity and starting to coach people. And so seeing other people stuck with creativity, and creativity in the broadest possible sense, like how do we make something happen that wouldn't happen unless we created it? Whether that's, writing a book, whether it's starting a business, whether it's creating a change in our lives or a new habit, like, unless we consciously decide to have a new habit and create it, it doesn't happen. I'd been wrestling with all of that, and I'd been writing emergently over that time by just sitting down and trying to write and see what happens. And so there it was. And, then, to kind of finish the story a little bit, I guess, in the end, after thinking about it a bit more, I realized it would be better as a series of books, because it allows, rather than a longer book with 4 parts to it, it allows people to really hit the part that resonates with them, that they want their help with. In this case, starting. So it allows people to dip in those different ways. And also, what was funny, like I said, it's really useful to have written a book in that way and have that becoming my thing. Because when I was getting stressed about, should I do 1 book or 4 books, I was talking to my brother, and it's like, I kind of like the 4-book idea, because then you can do the first one, see how it goes, and like do the second one having learned from the first one, just like you learn in the second piece from the first piece, and the 100th piece from the 99th piece. And so the other books in the series will be coming out this year, because they're already written, because they were also written, they're also taken from that 3 years of the 12-minute blog.
Thanks for sharing that journey. And actually, I just want to say, before I completely respond, because you're talking about this 12-minute method, and I know there'll be people watching saying this really resonates, this sounds exciting. So I want to say we will let people know about your Facebook community, where they can come and interact with you and learn more about this 12-minute method. So we will share that, folks. What I love about this is how, if you'd sat down and said, I wrote 4 books, we might have all been really overwhelmed, but you're literally saying it was over a period of time, and it was 12 minutes at a time. So you're really showing us how you can do it. And you didn't even know that you were writing 4 books. but you were simply exploring where you were in your journey. So there's, and I think that's what's so lovely about this. It isn't this sort of, you're removed from it and you're kind of telling us like, do this, do this, do this. You're taking us within your experience. So it feels like a therapeutic intervention, like just simply by reading these essays, we're being cleaned out in our body and in our mind. That was a sense that I got as I dived in.
Yeah, and what, let me just, a little thing to say to that is,
Yeah.
I can't speak for the readers, but that is absolutely what has happened to me over the
Mm.
process of having this practice. So I am a different person because of making that commitment. I am
Yeah.
changed in those ways that I mentioned in that quote that you gave a few minutes ago, and more. And I couldn't have predicted that at the start, but I did have some intuition, and I suspect that
Mm.
most of the people who might end up watching this have some intuition, whether it's writing or something different, that they want to be doing something, that there's a thing that
Yeah.
they wish they were doing, that maybe that they wish they'd started a few years ago. Like I've had that a lot. One of my favorite, things in that book is there's a Chinese proverb
Mm.
I've been told, which is something like, the best time to plant an apple tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And I really believe that, and try and live by it everywhere. But it's like the writing process. Yeah, it absolutely was that for me too.
And that really came across in the beginning. I'll go to that little post-it note. I know we're almost out of time. Don't worry, folks. We will, if Robbie agrees, we will have him back. But you talk about, first I began to see that I was changing, my sense of who I am was being changed. And that sort of speaks to me about how we might not have that identity as a writer or a business owner or as a creative. And so we're sort of like, I got to wait until I feel like this person. But what I get from this is that you became this writer, you became this creative, you became this show-upper to your practice by showing up.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like, I still don't really, I still don't really feel creative. I think it's maybe quite important to say that. I, like many of us, for whatever reason, have a story that I'm not creative in some way. And again, I could like tell some of that story. It may have something to do with being, I probably, certainly in my adolescence, I arguably was the least creative of my siblings. And that probably had an effect. And the odd teacher's remark certainly had an effect. I have to keep reminding myself, I was really lucky that one of my mentors, a guy called Phil Bolton, he once said to me, "Robbie, you're one of the most creative people I know," because I really respect him, and he knows a lot of people, and there's some kind of amazing people. I kind of had to listen to that, but it still took me, after he said that, probably 2 years to really absorb it. And I remind myself of it often because, yeah, I don't feel like a creative person, and yet, the longer time goes on, the harder it is to deny that I am, right? Because I look at the evidence
Yes.
of how much have I written, and there are poems on my website as well as articles, and like, I don't much, but I have written songs. It's like, it's undoubted, if in the cold light of day, that I have created a lot of stuff. But even then, I don't necessarily feel like it. I sometimes think that's quite an important thing to say, too.
Thank you for sharing that. And as I was listening to you, I was hearing that word evidence. And I think sometimes, to me, I almost see it as like scales. We've got the scales of the weight of the evidence that we've collected from our past. And it's about creating something in the present that eventually shifts that way that we perceive ourselves. When there's enough in the present that you allow yourself to see that says, this is proof of my creativity. It sounds like those scales are just, I don't know how close they are, but
Yeah.
working towards tipping.
I mean, if I meet my plans and release the other 3 books this year, like, really, once you've written 4 books, if you're not if you're not creative, who is? You might
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that another of my favorite pieces in that book is, I think it's called Becoming Someone Who Writes.
Mm.
And it was just this insight I had from a friend of mine who was just starting off on creating her own business, where she couldn't see yet that she was going to become someone who could create work for themselves. It was obvious to me from the outside that she was doing that, but it was very scary in the inside for her, because she was just starting out and didn't really know where the money was going to come from and had no track record. She couldn't look back at 3 years of being self-employed and say, I'll definitely make, evidence is I will make this work at that point.
Yeah.
And that was at the same time that I was noticing that I had suddenly become the experienced coach in a room full of coaches after kind of 2.5 years in, because a lot of people are moving into that industry, and some of the people were saying, you've been doing this for quite a while. And I was feeling like, no, I'm still making it up. But undeniably, I had done it for longer than them and coached more people and all that kind of thing. And the writing was absolutely the same thing. And the reason I think the practice is so powerful is that in the end, if you practice something enough, like that is how we change and how we become something new. I'd been practicing not doing things like the other two ideas about, the book and the business for quite a long time. And then I started practicing doing the thing. And it was really hard to do that because I was having to be a different person really to do that. And then now I've become someone, if my original aim in some ways was to become someone who can share themselves online without it feeling truly, truly horrible to do that, then that I have succeeded in that over, what are we on from that conversation with Joel, 5.5 years of practicing it. But it's only by the practicing that we change.
Yeah, that's a really exquisite point, and I feel like the whole conversation has been a beautiful example of that practicing and your change. Robbie, let me just hold it up for you so that you can enjoy it a little bit more. I love that you shared that, because again, it is so special, isn't it? It's like now in the physical world, it's being I feel like I'm that one person in this moment right now appreciating the book. I've read it, I've engaged with it. It's so special that I get that sense of how you're enjoying that. So we're gonna share some links. Like you've mentioned the Gay Hendricks book, you've mentioned Stephen Pressfield's book. So we'll share that in the info below. We're going to share the link to your Facebook group. I'm going to pop the link to your website as well. I'm just going to give you a moment to reflect, and like right now, if you were to follow the feeling, is there anything else that you feel drawn to share or to communicate?
That's a nice invitation. Gabrielle, nothing's coming up. It's just I guess to say it's been a really beautiful conversation for me. It's been, so thank you for hosting it and bringing your presence and inviting me. And of course, I'd love to come back, whether that's to talk more about this one or to talk about the other books when they arrive. And the next one hopefully will be April. So I want to say thank you for that. And I guess the other thing is, in a way, this conversation, can you hear? I don't know if you can hear. My daughter's just got home from nursery. People are listening.
I did hear a little bit of a tearful something in the background.
Leah's back. What's funny about Leah is she's a very loud baby, so it takes a little while. Over Christmas, we were with family, and I started feeling a bit self-conscious because people, I think, thought she was crying. Sometimes she's just like really loud and shouting.
So it's not tearful.
It could have been crying. It could have been crying. I don't know, but it could have been shouting. What I want to say, just in response to that invitation, is in a way, this conversation is a part of that same journey, and that's why I think what you said about this conversation being evidence of that is nice. But I like at the start in those 3 years particularly, but forever now, I've also been really influenced by Seth Godin, and what I found out by having this writing practice is that some of the things that he said are true. That if you have a writing practice, what he says is do it privately. If you want to have a blog and you're scared to share it with people, do it privately for a couple of weeks, and probably in a couple of weeks you'll be so proud of it you'll want to share it with people. So that's one thing, and I definitely found that to be true. But I also found that it changes if you write how you think, then having a writing practice is also a thinking practice. And if you write how you speak, then having a writing practice is also a speaking practice. And so when I got married in 2018, you know, I was just really aware giving a speech that I was giving a speech in a way that was transformed, partly because of this practice. And if I think about the way that I'm speaking now, part of the reason I feel in this moment, like really beautiful, like I've had a wonderful time, this time has flown by for me. Part of that is because I've been practicing that thinking in that way. And part of it is because I've been practicing having conversations with people too, you know, in a different way, which would be probably another call for us. But yeah, thank you for this conversation. It's such a pleasure for me. And
You're welcome. Can I
yeah,
reflect something back, actually? Because I really liked what you shared about the writing practice as a thinking practice and a speaking practice. One of the things that struck me throughout this interview is how great you were at giving stories behind the examples. Because I think we can have the points that we want to teach, but without the story to connect us to what those points mean, it becomes very difficult to learn. And as I was listening to you, the story was what was teaching me, which is why I think I refer to that book as a therapeutic intervention. We get taken on a story, and by the end of that story, maybe a bit like your David Gemmell, it's like we've been immersed in a world which has been told with detail and emotional truth, and then through that we get the lesson as well. So this practice, yeah, it shows on many different levels.
yeah, yeah. And just to add in, it's like I mentioned it before, you know, it's not finished for me. Like, but what's nice, the other nice thing about having the book, like I've mentioned a couple of times, is it's like in my face now, so I can't forget it. So one of the things that I set myself for this year is I want to be able to talk to people about this book as much as I can. And I was feeling incredibly overwhelmed by that. So overwhelmed. And then I was like, oh no, I have to listen to myself, don't I? And so, you know, like I put in 30 minutes a week to think about how to do that and to take action on it. And there's a way in which the 12-minute method is that simple. It is about practicing showing up and doing the thing too. And then, of course, what, you know, the kind of slightly clickbaity name of the series, the 12-minute method, hopefully gets a few more people in so that they can experience what you just said. And what you just said is absolutely beautiful. And I'll probably come back to this video and write it down because it's a really useful and amazing thing for somebody to say about something that I've made.
Great. Glad that you received that. Robbie, thank you. And folks, we will have Robbie back, and links below. Yeah, wishing you a lovely evening with your beautiful new babe.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to go and have some fun. It's going to be an experiment because my wife is going out. And so actually it's going to be the first time we're going to experiment. She's about 13 months, and because of lockdown, we haven't had to do this very much.
Yeah.
We're going to experiment with mummy not being there for bedtime at all. So there's an adventure to come for me this evening.
Yeah, exciting. Beautiful. Thanks, Robbie, and see you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriella.
Thank you.